Johnny Carson reached across the desk and turned off Dean Martin's microphone. The studio went completely silent. To understand why that silence mattered, you have to go back to the moment Dean walked onto that stage. It was March 1973. Dean Martin had been a guest on The Tonight Show more than 60 times by then. Johnny knew his rhythm. The audience knew his entrance. Dean would come through the curtain with that loose walk, that half smile, the way he always made it look like he'd just wandered in from somewhere more interesting. Tonight, he did all of that. But Johnny noticed something in the handshake. Dean's grip lingered half a second too long. They sat down. The audience settled. Johnny opened with the usual, "How's the show going? How's the golf game? Tell us about Vegas," Dean answered. He had all the right words. He knew how to hold a room. But there was something underneath it, something Johnny had learned to recognize over the years of doing this 5 nights a week. Dean was performing the performance. He was doing Dean Martin so carefully that it almost looked effortless. The first commercial break came 12 minutes in. Johnny and Dean stayed in their chairs while the cameras pulled back. Ed McMahon leaned over from his seat and said something quiet to Dean. Dean nodded but didn't really respond. Johnny watched this. He'd seen Dean handle 1,000 conversations, always with that easy charm, always making the other person feel like the most interesting one in the room. But tonight, Dean's eyes weren't quite focused. They were looking at Ed, but they were seeing something else. When they came back from break, Johnny shifted his approach. He started asking softer questions. Less about the show, more about life. Dean followed along. He told a story about playing golf with Sinatra. The audience laughed in the right places. Dean smiled in the right places. But Johnny kept noticing the small things. The way Dean's hand rested on the armrest, completely still. Dean Martin's hands were never still. They were always moving, gesturing, holding a cigarette, adjusting his tie. Still hands on Dean Martin meant something. About 8 minutes into the second segment, Johnny asked about the family. It wasn't meant to be anything, just a bridge to the next story. Dean smiled and started to say something about his daughter. Then he stopped. Not dramatically. He just stopped talking mid-sentence and looked down at his hands. The audience waited. They thought it was a setup. Dean Martin didn't fumble. Dean Martin didn't lose his place. The silence stretched out for 3 seconds, then 5. Johnny leaned forward slightly, the way he always did when he was reading someone. Dean looked back up, and his face had changed. Not crying, not breaking, just exposed in a way that didn't belong on television. Dean started talking again, but he wasn't answering Johnny's question anymore. He was talking about his son, Dean Paul Martin, Dino, a pilot, 21 years old. Dean's voice stayed steady, but the words came slower. He told a story about teaching Dino to fly, about watching him solo for the first time, about how proud he was, about how Dino had that same fearlessness Dean remembered having when he was young, before the world taught you to be careful. The audience was still smiling. They didn't know yet. This sounded like a proud father story, the kind Dean had told before, the kind that usually ended with a joke about his son being a better pilot than he ever was. But Johnny knew. Johnny had lost his son Richard in a car accident the year before. Johnny knew exactly what Dean's face looked like right now because he'd seen it in his own mirror every morning for months. Dean kept talking. He described Dino's last phone call, 3 days ago. They'd talked about flying weather, about some girl Dino was seeing, about whether Dean might come out to watch him practice next week. Normal things, father and son things. Dean said Dino had told him he loved him before hanging up. Dean said he'd told him the same thing back. His voice caught slightly on that last part, and then Dean said, very quietly, that was the last time. The studio went quiet in a different way, not waiting for a punchline, understanding. Dean looked at Johnny. He went up yesterday morning, somewhere over the San Bernardino Mountains. They haven't found the plane yet. Johnny didn't move. He didn't reach for a joke. He didn't try to comfort. He just held Dean's eyes for a long moment, and in that moment, 2 fathers sat across from each other with a truth that had no punchline. Johnny's face didn't change expression. He didn't need to. Dean could see everything in that stillness. The teleprompter kept scrolling, the cameras kept running, the audience sat frozen. No one knew what to do. This wasn't how The Tonight Show worked. You came on, you told stories, you made people laugh, you promoted your latest project, you left. You didn't bleed in front of strangers. But Dean wasn't bleeding. He was just present, terribly, completely present. Dean started to say something else. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked down again at his hands, and this time his shoulders dropped in a way that made him look smaller in the chair. The studio lights felt too bright. The desk between them felt too wide. Everything about the architecture of a talk show, the setup designed for entertainment, suddenly felt wrong for what was happening. That's when Johnny reached across the desk. He didn't touch Dean. He reached for the microphone switch on Dean's lapel and turned it off. Then he turned off his own. For 40 seconds, the two men sat in complete silence on live television. Dean's microphone was dead. Johnny's microphone was dead. But the cameras stayed on them. The audience could see their faces. They could see Dean's chest rise and fall. They could see Johnny sitting absolutely still, not performing, not hosting, just being there. They could see Dean close his eyes for a moment, then open them again. No one in the studio moved. The crew didn't cut to commercial. The director in the booth didn't give a signal. Doc Severinsen didn't lift his baton. Ed McMahon didn't shift in his chair. Everyone understood, without being told, that something was happening that was more important than the show, more important than the format, more important than what was supposed to happen next. In the control room, the producer reached for the commercial button twice and stopped both times. He could see on the monitors what was happening. He could see that the silence itself was the story, that breaking it would be a kind of violence. Dean finally looked up. He nodded once at Johnny. Johnny nodded back. Then Johnny reached over and turned Dean's microphone back on. He turned his own back on. The sound came back into the room. You could hear someone in the audience shift in their seat. You could hear the hum of the lights. Johnny didn't ask another question. He didn't try to move the show forward. He just said, very quietly, "You didn't have to come tonight." Dean's voice was steady again. "I know, but sitting at home is worse." Johnny understood that too. After Richard died, Johnny had come back to work 3 days later. People had asked him why. Some had suggested he take more time. Others had looked at him with concern, wondering if he was pushing himself too hard. He'd never been able to explain it properly, but Dean had just explained it for both of them. Sitting at home is worse. At home, there's nothing to do but feel it. Here, there's a shape to the time, a reason to stand up, a reason to put on the suit. They stayed there for another few minutes, not talking much. Johnny asked simple questions. Did Dean want water? Did he want to stay for the rest of the show, or did he want to leave? Dean said he'd stay if Johnny didn't mind. Johnny said he didn't mind at all. That Dean could stay as long as he wanted. That they didn't have to talk. That they could just sit there if that's what felt right. The audience watched this conversation the way you watch something through a window. Present but separate. They were witnessing an agreement being made between two men about how to survive the next 30 minutes. There was something profound in how ordinary it sounded. No grand declarations, just two people figuring out how to get through. They sat there together for a while longer, two men who'd spent decades making people laugh, now just keeping each other company in the worst kind of silence. Dean told one more story about Dino. About how his son used to sit in the audience when Dean performed in Vegas. How Dino would watch from the back, never front row, because he didn't want people to know he was Dean Martin's kid. He wanted to just be another person watching his father work. Dean smiled when he said this. It was a real smile, but it had grief inside it. The kind of smile that says, I know I'll never see this again, but I'm grateful I saw it at all. Eventually, Johnny turned to the audience. He didn't explain what had happened. He didn't apologize for the silence or the departure from format. He just said, "We're going to take a break. We'll be right back." His voice was calm, professional, but there was something else in it. A weight, a tenderness. During the commercial, Dean and Johnny stayed in their chairs. The crew moved around them quietly, carefully. Someone brought water. No one spoke. Doc Severinsen, usually quick with a quip, stood by his bandstand and said nothing. Ed McMahon watched from his chair, his face tight. The makeup woman came over to check Dean's face and stopped halfway, realizing there was nothing to fix. Dean just waved her off gently. When they came back from commercial, Johnny didn't bring out the next guest. He just talked with Dean, quietly, about things that had nothing to do with show business, about being a father, about phone calls you replay in your head, about the difference between public grief and private grief, about how you keep standing when standing feels impossible, about whether it ever gets easier. Neither of them had an answer to that last one. The audience stayed silent. They'd come for jokes. They'd come for celebrity gossip and funny anecdotes and the comfortable rhythm of late-night television. They were witnessing something else. Some of them understood it immediately. Other parents, other people who'd lost someone, other people who'd gotten a phone call that cut their life into before and after. Others just felt the weight of it without knowing exactly why. But no one looked away. No one got up to leave. They stayed because leaving felt like abandonment. Near the end, Dean said something that Johnny would remember for the rest of his life. Dean said, "The worst part is, everyone's going to want me to be okay. And I will be. I'll go back to the show, I'll do the concerts, I'll be Dean Martin again. People need that. They need me to be the guy who doesn't let anything touch him. But right now, for just a minute, I needed to not be okay. And you let me." Johnny didn't respond with words. He just reached out and placed his hand on Dean's arm for a moment. The audience could see his hand there, resting gently on Dean's sleeve. Then he let go. The show ended without fanfare. No big goodbye, no final joke to send everyone home laughing. Just Johnny thanking Dean for being there, and Dean standing up, shaking his hand with both hands this time, and walking back through the curtain. The audience applauded, but it was a different kind of applause. Quieter, more like a gesture of respect than celebration. The next day, the network received calls. Some people were angry. They said it was inappropriate. They said Dean shouldn't have been on television in that condition. They said Johnny should have cut to commercials sooner, should have protected him from himself, should have made it lighter, should have known better than to let grief onto a talk show. But most of the calls were different. They were from fathers who'd lost sons, from mothers who'd lost daughters, from people who'd never had a public space to not be okay. They said thank you. They said they'd never seen grief treated with that kind of respect on television. They said it mattered that Johnny hadn't tried to fix it, hadn't tried to make it better, had just sat there and let Dean be exactly what he was. Human, broken, still standing. Johnny never talked about that night publicly. When interviewers asked, he'd say Dean Martin was a good friend and leave it at that. But people who worked on the show remembered. They remembered the 40 seconds of silence. They remembered Johnny's hand on the microphone switch. They remembered that sometimes the most important thing a host can do is stop hosting and just be another person in the room. Years later, after Johnny retired, someone asked him what his most important night on The Tonight Show was. He didn't mention the big stars or the huge ratings or the historic moments. He mentioned a night in March 1973 when he turned off 2 microphones and let silence do what words couldn't. Dean Martin never came back to talk about that night either. He went back to being Dean Martin. He did his show. He did his concerts. He smiled that smile. He sang the songs. But everyone who'd been in that studio knew what it cost. They knew what it meant to keep standing. And they knew that for 40 seconds on a stage designed for laughter, Dean hadn't had to pretend. The cameras had captured it all. But the network never replayed that episode. It stayed in the vault, too raw, too real, too much like watching someone's actual life instead of their television life. Which meant that the people who saw it live were the only ones who ever did. They became witnesses to something television wasn't built for. 2 men sitting in silence, holding space for a grief too big for words, while the whole world watched. The studio lights went down that night the way they always did. The crew packed up. The audience filed out quietly, without the usual chatter. But something had happened there that you couldn't pack up or file away. A moment when entertainment stopped and humanity took over. When Dean Martin wasn't a star and Johnny Carson wasn't a host. They were just 2 fathers who understood what it meant to lose everything and still have to keep the lights on. That's what the silence was, not empty, full.